Right, looks like people are starting to join. Right, we've got a few people in here so far. Just going to give everyone a couple of minutes to start joining and then we'll get started. All right, well, welcome everybody. It looks like we have a decent number of people in here so far. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We're really excited to have this conversation about what's going on with our national infrastructure and how it connects to real community level impact. I'm going to turn it over to our fantastic presenters today just to get us started. Today we're being joined by Caroline from ASCE, as well as our very own Natalie Selmo from Engineers Without Borders. I'll turn it over to both of you just to introduce yourselves and your organizations.
I'm happy to go first. Thank you so much for having me here this evening. My name is Caroline Severe, and I am the Managing Director of Government Relations and Infrastructure Initiatives at the American Society of Civil Engineers. At ASCE, we represent about 160,000 individual civil engineers from the public sector, private sector, as well as academia. And they represent engineers both in the United States, but engineers also globally. So some of our largest priorities are making sure we are protecting public health, safety, and welfare. And the report card for America's infrastructure, which I'll be discussing during the presentation today, really helps give us that snapshot of what current conditions are so that we know what we need to be prioritizing in the future.
Thanks, Caroline. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Selmo. I'm a senior program engineer here at Engineers Without Borders USA, and I focus on our Community Engineering Corps program, which is our domestic program that partners with communities here in the U.S. and U.S. territories. The program, we've been around for over 10 years now. It was founded in 2014, and it was actually founded by EWB USA in addition to ASCE and the American Water Works Association. So since then, in the past 10 years, we've engaged with over 400 communities across the US, including US territories and tribal nations. And really what we specialize in is providing that preliminary engineering piece that allows communities to unlock funding and make infrastructure improvements. So just like to give you some idea of what that's looked like over the past 10 years, we helped communities secure over $30 million and counting. And through volunteers like yourselves, we have provided over 40,000 hours of pro bono support, which totals over $5 million. So we're really excited to share some of the projects that we've been working on and how it relates to the ASCE infrastructure report card.
Awesome. Thank you both. Yeah, so we're just going to start off. Caroline will give us an overview about the ASCE report card from 2025, and then we're really excited to dig in and talk about what we've been seeing in our communities.
Go ahead and get started.
Yeah, go ahead, Caroline.
Thank you so much. So this evening, I'm going to be going over our 2025 report card for America's infrastructure. That report came out in March of this year, and it provides an assessment in time for what the current conditions are for the nation's infrastructure, but even more importantly, what some solutions are in order to raise the grades going forward. So every 4 years since 1998, ASCE has prepared this comprehensive assessment of the nation's major infrastructure categories for up to 18 different categories of infrastructure in our 2025 report. And those categories have really grown over the year, with this year with our 18 categories having broadband for the first time ever added in. As a new category in our 2021 report card, for example, we added in stormwater. So it's been growing with each iteration of the report. But as I talk about the report card, one important thing to note is what we really mean by infrastructure and really why it's so critical to every single American household. Our infrastructure is the foundation of our economy. It's what makes us competitive in the global marketplace, and of course, our quality of life depends on it. But often our infrastructure is out of sight, it's out of mind, and it's not until we see deficiencies in that infrastructure that we start to feel the impact, whether it be by delays or having all the groceries in your refrigerator spoiled when there's a power outage. So it's really often not until those times that we start to feel those impacts. So as we are looking at infrastructure, it's a lot more than just roads and bridges. It's all of the airports that we need to travel. It's the schools our children attend, the parks that we all enjoy, the water that we're drinking, our public transit that's helping us get to and from work. It's those power lines that are keeping our lights on, and so many other aspects that help us with our daily lives. So using an A through F school report card format, the report card has really been able to provide this thorough assessment of the current conditions, and it's trying to make it in a really easily digestible format for not just policymakers, but the general public as well, so that we can start to bring this to the forefront of their minds as we're talking about it. We can go to the next slide. So I want to share here what our 2025 report card grades are. The 2025 report card did mark the first time ever that America's cumulative GPA reached a C. That's the highest it's ever been, and it's a slight improvement from 2021 C- grade. Another important thing to note is that for the first time since we've been doing this in 1998, there's no category here that you see that actually received a D- grade. And only 2 of the 18 categories that we graded actually saw the grade go down, while 8 categories improved and the remainder stayed the same. And I think a lot of these improvements can really be accredited to a record level of investment that we saw, or a federal investment, I should say, that we saw from 2021's Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which included more than $550 billion in new funding for infrastructure programs, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed the following year in 2022. And that marked really the single largest climate investment in the United States and had a lot of dollars that were focused on the resilience of our infrastructure systems. So with each bill trying to prioritize the infrastructure that we have in place, trying to prioritize the resilience of our built environment, we have started to really see a true movement here with a lot of these grades. And that's why we saw the overall GPA go up for the second iteration in a row to a C from that C-. But this is the first time ever that we've had 2 consecutive report cards with that overall GPA going up. Getting back to this report, though, as I said, all of these dollars have really led to some positive results, but we do still have 9 categories that are in the D range. And a lot of those categories are categories that Americans are using every single day. So it's the roads we're driving on, it's our transit systems, and it's our energy grid. And these are very often categories that are requiring maintenance and updates, but they just simply don't have the investments and the funding that are needed to keep those systems in a state of good repair. Stormwater and transit are the 2 categories that you can see here that are actually tied for the lowest grade of D. However, for the first time ever, transit did see its grade go up and it's no longer a D-. But these are both categories that face a lot of the similar risks due to rising costs and sustainability and resiliency needs. In fact, over 60% of the nation's stormwater utilities actually are saying that aging infrastructure is posing a pretty significant concern for their long-term needs, and they simply don't have the funding to keep up with that, especially as we're seeing increasingly severe weather events. Then we do have 8 categories. The 8 categories that did see the grades go up, those are dams, hazardous waste, and then waterways, levees, ports, public parks, roads, and transit. And those are all the categories that really benefited from increased federal funding. That's where we've seen a lot of upgrades being made, and that is what has led to our increased GPA. And that some remainder of those categories, again, did stay consistent with their previous grades. The 2 categories that did fall, energy and rail, they had declines due to safety and capacity concerns. So first, looking at energy, as we've had this shift to renewable energy, as we're bringing new sources online, we're also retiring legacy systems such as coal. So our overall total generation capacity really has remained stagnant while we have seen significantly increased demand on the system. We have surging demands from data centers, from the use of AI, the overall electrification of our transportation sector with electric vehicles coming online. And that has led to this increased demand. And it has also led to the needs for our energy sector really skyrocketing since our last report card in 2021. In fact, our report actually found that we now face a 10-year investment gap of about $600 billion in the energy sector, which is more than double where we were in 2021. And that would be to essentially meet the demands and then safeguard the grid from extreme weather events and cyber attacks in the future. Then turning to rail, the other grade that went down, it is still, however, the second highest grade in the overall report card. That we found there that essentially we have sufficient funding and we have efficient movement in freight through well-managed rail lines, but train safety incidents have been on the increase since 2020. And this is not simply East Palestine. We are just seeing increased incidents across the entire system. And they really are indicating to us that we need to do a lot more to improve rail crossings, especially when they're intersecting with our roads, because that's where a majority of these incidents are occurring. So that safety issue is the primary reason why that grade went down. And then ports, that did receive our highest grade, our little bright spot there. Our nation's ports, we have over 300 coastal and inland waterways ports. They provide nearly 22 million jobs for Americans, nearly $3 trillion in GDP, but they are adjusting to a lot of disruptions that have been caused in the supply chain. First, we had the pandemic causing an initial decline in containerized imports, and then we suddenly had a very significant surge after that. However, we have seen funding nearly double thanks to federal investments, and this has now allowed ports to really build out resiliency plans, better assess what a lot of their needs are, and then address those needs both on the water and land side. But they're going to continue to face a lot of new challenges as we look to some of these climate shifts. We can go to the next slide. Outside of the grades, the report card does also identify some key trends and some overarching solutions. Some of the key trends that we saw this time around is one, extreme weather events. That was something we could not avoid in any of the chapters as we have had an increasing amount of severe weather or extreme weather events, I should say. Each category of infrastructure is feeling those impacts, and that's something that needs to be considered as we're going forward and how we're going to build these systems more resiliently. Next, we have this need for sustained investments, and I'll go into that a bit more in a moment. But we've seen increased federal funding here. We've seen state and local governments continue to fund. We've seen an increase in public-private partnerships. But if we don't sustain these investments, we're not going to be able to sustain this overall C grade. We continue to have an increased needs, and we need to make sure that the current baseline of funding is where we're starting out going forward, and that we're not snapping back to previous funding levels. And then last but not least, we continue to see a need for reliable and available public data, since that's one of our key performance indicators across all of these categories. And this is really necessary so that engineers know where they need to prioritize limited public dollars. We can go to the next slide again. As I have promised, talking about the overall and sustained investments, beyond the grades, the other pretty critical piece to the report card is what we project as our overall infrastructure investment gap. The 2025 report card did see that overall investment gap go up to $3.7 trillion between 2024 and 2023. And that is up from about $2.6 trillion that we identified as the 2021 infrastructure investment gap. And that overall increase in the gap is really primarily down to two sectors. One, energy, which I already mentioned, where we saw those overall needs more than double. And the other sector that has really seen needs balloon is in the water sector. So that's really what is driving about $1 trillion in this overall infrastructure investment gap. Other categories, like a lot of our transportation categories, are actually starting to see that overall gap start to shrink. But due to some of the needs in energy and water, that gap is still going up quite a bit. So I think that what this is really demonstrating for us is that a lot of the funding and laws like the IIJA and the IRA, they have created a bit of a jump start here, but a lot more needs to be done. And again, we need to be sustaining investment levels. Outside of our report card, we also have done an economic study called Bridging the Gap. And in that study, we found that each American household is actually losing about $2,000 per year due to faulty infrastructure. However, if we were to snap back or go back to pre-IIJA funding levels, American families would be losing on average about $2,700 a year. So by sustaining investments, we're saving American families about $700 a year in terms of keeping our infrastructure saving Americans from more failures in deficient infrastructure. But again, there's still a lot more that needs to be done. We can go to the next slide again. The final piece I do want to highlight as a part of the report card is our overarching key solutions. And if you dig into the report card itself, you will see we have pretty granular policy solutions for every single report card category. But then we've also identified 3 solutions that cut across all 18 categories. Those key solutions that we've identified this time around is 1, sustaining investment, which I've just highlighted, making sure we're prioritizing the resiliency of our system, and then making sure we're advancing innovative policy solutions. First, I've already kind of dug into sustaining investment and what that means. As we are looking to the reauthorization of the IIJA, as that bill will expire next year, our first priority really right now is making sure, as we're reauthorizing surface transportation programs, reauthorizing state revolving funds, that the IIJA is seen as the new baseline going forward. But we're going to have to do some other things to bring down costs of projects, things such as permitting reform, implementing asset management plans, and of course, resilient measures, which leads me to my second recommendation. The United States is continuing to be hit by these storms of greater intensity and duration. And last year alone, we actually saw about 27 extreme weather events caused nearly $200 billion in damages. And that's including the destruction of a lot of critical infrastructure, never mind the nearly 600 lives that were lost due to those events. So at ASCE, we are strongly advocating for investments in resilient infrastructure, as we find they are a way to essentially effectively use limited public dollars. They're going to reduce costs in the long term, as we don't need to continuously rebuild after a weather event. And for that reason, we are really advocating for making sure states and locals are adopting or incentivizing communities to use the most up-to-date building codes and standards, as they are not just rehabbing infrastructure, but building new infrastructure as well. And then last but not least, on that policy innovation piece, this ranges from everything such as permitting reform, which I mentioned, making sure we are successfully integrating our infrastructure network, making sure we have the engineers that are necessary to actually implement and build this infrastructure. It's really a long list, and all of that is available again on our website, which brings me to my last slide. In short, we are moving in the right direction here, but we need to sustain these investments. We need to make sure we're prioritizing resilience, and we need to create a lot more entry points for the profession, so that we can kind of keep these grades headed in the right direction. Again, a lot more information on our website, so check out infrastructurereportcard.org if you want to dig into any of these categories. And I will pause there.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, I think it's so important. I just really appreciate that you took the time in the beginning too to define what infrastructure is. because, especially as an engineer, and I know I'm in good company with engineers on this call, you often think of infrastructure as the physical pipes or the concrete. And it's just so important to humanize what infrastructure is. It really is, the livelihood of communities. And we really like to think of it as infrastructure equals quality of life. And like you said, you don't realize how much infrastructure impacts your life until it is deficient, until it isn't functioning, until that road that you take every single day to work is closed, or until you wake up one morning and, like you said, you open up the fridge and all the food is spoiled because the power went out in the middle of the night. Um, and I think that the communities that we work with here at Community Engineering Corps and in the US for EWB are really the communities that were left behind those large federal investments, or communities where, large infrastructure projects might have changed the fabric and the culture of their communities. Or just communities that are, so small that they don't have the capacity or the expertise to really make those infrastructure improvements that they need that really impact the quality of life for the people that live in those communities. So I'd love to dive into a couple of examples of kind of what we're seeing, and just see how that relates to the report card. And kind of before I get started, I know just some housekeeping things really quickly. I see some questions coming in, which is awesome. If you do have questions, please feel free to go ahead and type them in that Q&A box, and we'll definitely be sure to leave some time for Carolyn and I to answer those. So thanks for already populating that. But yeah, I kind of just wanted to start, you talked a lot about the water and how water is contributing to that funding gap. And we work with, or we partner with several communities in Maryland that are, just an hour outside of our nation's capital that lack basic infrastructure to basic water and wastewater infrastructure. So no, when we're talking about the infrastructure in these communities for water and wastewater, we're talking um, not just leaky pipes, but that they don't even exist at all. So like narrowing in on one community that's about an hour south of Washington, D.C. We partnered with a community where they reached out to us because one day, a young couple that just recently moved into this community. It's rural Maryland, kind of like right off the highway. If you imagine turning off the highway up this dirt road, there's a community of about 16 homes. And this couple that just moved into the community turned on their tap one morning, and there was just burnt, brown smelling water that came out. They reached out to their neighbors, they were just meeting for the first time, and they noticed, and their neighbors were experiencing the same thing. And it wasn't until then that they realized that they, along with the other 15 homes in this community, were all operating off of a well, and that well collapsed. So it left, all 50 people in that community without drinking water. And they quickly came together. Their water board, they got an initial cost estimate to connect to the local utility. But because it was across the highway, it was going to cost the community around $1 million, which just, wasn't feasible for this small community of 16 homes and 50 people. So that's kind of where we came in to partner with them to help look for some alternate solutions, which, in the meantime, they had to haul in water, which was a significant financial burden for this community. But we did work with them and some other technical assistance providers who are partners of ours to outline some options and develop a full preliminary engineering report. And with that report, they were able to go after federal funding, and they were awarded $100,000 to develop a new well for their communities. But I point this one out because, this is one where this couple moved into the community and wasn't even thinking about their water infrastructure. Like you said, it's often out of sight, out of mind until it isn't. And it really wasn't it was that couple and the other really dedicated individuals in the community that had to, dedicate their own time and energy to make sure that they were able to get drinking water back into their homes. It was these individuals who were volunteering their time as part of the community water board, and they were able to reach out and get these technical services pro bono so that they were able to improve their water infrastructure and have clean running water in their taps again. And there's another community in Maryland too. This is about 20 minutes if you're driving 20 minutes east from this community. So almost on the coast of Maryland. We're currently working with a community it's a historic Black community made up of about 70 residents. And the community lacks any kind of centralized water and wastewater systems, meaning that they rely entirely on private wells and septic tanks. And many of these systems are more than 30 years old, which is, near or exceeding their expected lifespan for those systems. The residents also have reasons to believe that there's some contamination in their drinking water sources. So they really want to develop a centralized system for both water and wastewater. And, they want to do so not only to improve their drinking water and wastewater infrastructure for themselves, but also really just to bring life into the area. They want to welcome businesses back in. This is a community that people have been leaving, and they want to boost the economy, and they can't do that without drinking water. You can't do that without wastewater. So we are going to be working with them to again develop a preliminary engineering report that outlines some options for them to develop a centralized system. And then, the goal is that they would take that and find some funding sources and really bring the system into reality so that they not only have reliable drinking water in their homes, but that they can bring in some new businesses and really breathe some life back into this historic community. So yeah, I think that just kind of highlights, how much a lot of us take drinking water for granted. We take turning on our tap for granted, and how much drinking water just impacts our lives outside of just drinking and bathing and what we do for water. It's really this economy and the livelihood for these communities. So I was just curious, Caroline, you talked a little bit about the water, wastewater. If you could dive a little bit more into what the report card shows for that, the water, drinking water in particular, and do these stories like resonate with that grade at all?
Yes, sorry, it was on mute still. So I think stories like this really resonate and really help illustrate why we didn't see significant improvement in our water grades. Drinking water, wastewater, for example, both of those grades have stayed the same despite a lot of increased investment from the federal government. And that's really because the needs are so significant across our water sector. So just to kind of go back and jog everyone's memory, because I'm sure we didn't all memorize all the grades on the slide. Our overall drinking water grade was a C minus, wastewater grade was a D plus, stormwater grade a D, again, tied for one of the lowest grades on the report card. And a lot of this is due to overall access to the public for safe drinking water. It's taking into account on the drinking water side things like aging infrastructure, emerging contaminants like PFAS, increasingly severe effects of extreme weather on our drinking water systems. So at this point in time, what our report card found, just looking at our drinking water systems, that we are expecting the average expected life of our pipes is about 79 years old. So we are asking a lot of them, and there's still more than 9 billion miles of existing lead service lines across the country. So the needs, as we are digging more into this, continue to really grow. And a lot of utilities are trying to improve this infrastructure. They're using innovations, trying to identify issues before they become failures but still only about 30% of water utilities have been able to fully implement an asset management plan. And it's really difficult for many utilities to actually set rates that are in line with needs just due to affordability issues. And that's just the drinking water sector. In the wastewater sector, we have close to 18,000 wastewater treatment plants across the country, but they are all facing a lot of increased pressure from the public sector, from the private sector, in order to produce advanced treatment outcomes, even as a lot of these systems are aging. And really, a large percentage of them don't have the funding that matches what their needs are. I think our report found that only about 30% of the wastewater sector thinks they have things are able to meet their overall needs. And then when we get to stormwater, this is really a sector that more than any other is getting impacted by extreme weather events. And this is an area where utilities, they're increasing fees to support a lot of their growing costs. A lot of that is falling onto ratepayers. But at the end of the day, they just haven't been able to keep pace with what a lot of the demands are. And we are seeing impaired rivers and streams increasing. It was like it increased by over 100,000 miles of impaired rivers and streams over the past decade alone. And a lot of stormwater utilities, again, 60% say that they just don't have the ability to meet their long-term funding needs going forward. So we've seen some help from the federal government. A lot of state and local governments are trying to address this, but the needs are just so extreme that it is one of the main reasons why we saw that overall investment gap increase. And that's really based on those needs in the water sector.
Thanks for diving deeper into that. I think like speaking to that in investment gap a little bit more, there's a couple other communities where, I mentioned that we were able to help these communities secure some funding, and we have a couple more examples of that as it pertains to roads. And I'd love to touch on that gap a little bit more. But starting just, well, I know roads is obviously one of the first things that comes to mind when people think of infrastructure in the US, because it's something that we actually see every day. And we're working with a couple communities. One right now in Utah. This is a community of about 800 residents, and this community has experienced economic hardship because of the closure of some major businesses in the area. There was a military base that closed, and it left a lot of unemployment and left the area a kind of a lower income area in a smaller town. And their main street is actually made up. It's this picture on the left. Their main street is made up of essentially a four-lane highway. That's a very high speed corridor. And this is kind of the heart of their town. And unfortunately, this community has experienced the loss of loved ones through pedestrian, fatalities because of this corridor. And I think that this just highlights, the need for investment in these small community infrastructure and safety measures. We're working with them in particular to do a safety corridor audit to provide some safety recommendations for both pedestrian and vehicular safety on this main road. But if this community, they're run by a small staff, and they have been doing their best at seeking funding sources so that they can afford to make those necessary improvements once the recommendations are made. But the reality is that if the funding isn't there, they're not able to make those improvements. Similarly, in another community in Pennsylvania that we worked with, another, small rural community. This community is made of about 100 people. And they had a main street that also was crumbling. It was deteriorating, and it was, not only a safety concern for the vehicles and the people walking on this road, but there also were houses downstream, and that was causing some stormwater runoff and flooding in the houses, causing a danger to the people that owned the homes there. And this community, I wanted to highlight because they did have some funding available to make some improvements, but they didn't have the engineering funds to actually design the road. So they had a small grant to make the improvements on milling and repaving, but they didn't have the actual engineering. And so we worked with them to provide some engineering solutions to address the concerns that they had with their road. And they were able to utilize that to find some more funding and get all the funding that they needed to make the improvements, because the original grant that they had was rather small, and it wasn't gonna make the necessary improvements that they needed. So I bring this up just because, both of these communities, when we're talking about improvements, the community in Pennsylvania, for example, the money that they needed was just over $100,000. It was $103,000 to make these improvements. And I imagine that, the community in Utah will be something similar, which, when we're talking about a $3.7 trillion funding gap, $100,000 is pennies compared to that, but it means everything to these small communities. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about just, one of the key recommendations was that sustained investment. What actually does that look like, and how do we ensure that that sustained investment trickles down to, these small communities that really need it the most and maybe were left out of investments in the past?
So I think as we're talking about that sustained investment, and as particularly as we're looking at roads, bridges, etc., it's really looking to that next surface transportation reauthorization bill. Surface transportation bill was sort of the crux of the IIJA, and then we kind of built out onto these other sectors. But we started with a surface transportation reauthorization. So that's going to be expiring as well. And at ASCE, what we are really talking about there is making sure that the surface reauthorization levels that we have over the past several years from the IIJ, that's where we need to be starting from. And we need to be continuing to build onto that, because again, as I said, with that infrastructure investment gap chart, we are starting to see that gap actually shrink in the roads category, in the bridge category. Those are not the ones that are leading to this kind of implosion in the overall infrastructure investment gap. So we've made investments. We're starting to see the progress of those investments. And at ASCE, we are making sure that, especially programs like the Highway Safety Improvement Program, that rail grade crossing program, like that, those are ones that these safety programs that we're making investments there, because we're continuing to see an increase in overall fatalities on our roadway system. Both for pedestrians as well as drivers or cyclists or other people that are using the roadway system. I think another really critical piece, though, here, as we're talking about some of these smaller, more rural communities, is that a very large percentage of funding in the IIJA, there was a lot of it that was going out through grants. Yes, there was a lot that went through the typical formula programs as well, but a lot of this grant funding was really inaccessible to a lot of small rural communities, because they simply don't have the technical assistance in order to apply for that grant. And they really don't have the bandwidth or the knowledge base in order to do so and be successful. There have been some programs through groups like the National League of Cities that have tried to assist some of these communities, but of course, that's still not enough assistance that we really see across the country. So as we're looking to the next reauthorization bill, I think we're going to see a lot less money going into a lot of these grant programs, and a lot more of that funding being moved back into the formula programs, which should then theoretically assist states getting these dollars down to some of these communities where they've identified what these priorities are, and that these communities can then be working with their state in order to get some of these funds, versus having less money overall going to the state because of the grant programs, and then these communities having to try to figure out for themselves how to get that money from the federal government, which is just very difficult for them to do. So I think that's going to be a pretty important piece to this next surface reauthorization bill, which at this point we're expecting to probably see some legislative text in the early fall.
That's really good to know because yeah, you're exactly right. The communities just don't have, the technical expertise or the knowledge to access those funds, and then it's up to the state. And a lot of times, in cases like these, you need the money in order to get the money. And
Exactly.
that's what these communities lack. So that's great to hear. Um, I think, the other recommendation that really resonated with us at Community Engineering Corps was just the need for resilient infrastructure. Um, we recognize the importance of that and really try to incorporate it into all of our work, even on these, what people would consider really small projects. And we're also seeing a lot of really small communities, not just small communities, but we're seeing a lot of communities that would be considered underserved, really taking resilient infrastructure into mind and into heart, and really, they're the ones that are in many ways impacted by these, storm events the most, and they're the ones that see and recognize the need for resilient infrastructure in their communities. So I kind of just wanted to highlight a couple of the things that we're doing and then talk a little bit more about that. Um, so, I mentioned some communities that are actively pursuing resilient infrastructure, which is really amazing to see. We've worked with a lot of communities in Puerto Rico, for example, where we are designing or helping to design solar systems for, we've worked with children's centers. We're currently working with a healthcare clinic in Puerto Rico. And we've also worked with a couple communities that are actually designing resiliency centers themselves. So they're taking structures that were, previously schools or other buildings and turning them into resiliency centers so that when a storm event or, extreme weather event does happen in these communities, the communities have a place to go with reliable power so that they can, not only charge their devices, but they have a place where they can store their medicines that are critical, for their life. Um, and I just think that that's really cool, to see, when we think of resilient infrastructure, we're thinking, how can we design this to withstand a, 100-year flood? Or how can we design this to make sure that it doubles the lifespan? But it's really cool to see some of these smaller communities, actively pursuing that resilient infrastructure and thinking of things like resiliency centers for their communities. Knowing that, ideally they would love to improve the overall infrastructure of their community, but that might not be practical right now. So what can they do with what they have in developing these resiliency centers is one of those, which is, I think, really cool. Other projects that we see that are addressing kind of extreme weather events and really incorporating resilient infrastructure at the forefront is like this community on the right is a park in Arkansas that this community experiences flooding all around the community really when they have extreme weather events, which are more and more frequent that they are experiencing. And they reached out to us because they one recognize the flooding concerns in this park, but then they also recognize that they could utilize this park for their stormwater and to address the stormwater challenges, and really wanted to turn it into a green infrastructure with some stormwater solutions space so that the stormwater has a place to go within the community when they do experience these events. So yeah, it's just really, it's important at a large scale, the resilient infrastructure, and it's also really really inspirational to see the communities that are really impacted by extreme weather events really take it into consideration when they're thinking about how can they improve their communities for well into the future, into the long haul. So yeah, I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit more about what the report card says about resilient infrastructure and what that looks like.
Sure. So, as I had mentioned, resilience is one of our key solutions throughout. And if you go to our site, or if you go into some of the individual chapters, you're going to see there are going to be specific policy recommendations related to resilience in every single chapter throughout the report card. At ASCE, really become a broken record as we've been talking about resilience, whether it be from a larger perspective at the state level, making sure we're doing things like creating state resilience officers who are actually able to create a plan throughout the state for their in terms of what some of their investment needs are. We're going down to more individualized local projects that we have had federal programs really start to incentivize the use of the most up-to-date codes and standards. The best example of that had been the FEMA's BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities program. I'm not always good at defining what the acronym means. That had been a great example that was incentivizing the use of the most up-to-date codes and standards in order to build more resiliently. Unfortunately, that is a program that the current administration has ended, something that ASCE is now trying to work with Congress to try to bring back. And there were a lot of really critical programs that had to do with resilience in the IIJ that we hope to continue to see funded going forward. So the PROTECT program, for example, has been a great one to start to get dollars out the door for communities in order to address some of their needs. Some of them are, really small projects related to culverts and stuff like that in order to make, local bridges more resilient to overtopping. So I think there's a lot of really great projects that are happening across the country, and it's really about making sure all levels of government are incentivizing communities to continue to invest in resilience, but also working with them to make sure that communities understand what the most up-to-date codes and standards are and that they're starting to adopt them, and really trying to work with policymakers to kind of thread that needle that, yes, while investments in resilience might cost a bit more at the beginning, in the long term, it is going to be a cost savings for a community if we're able to invest something wisely now and not have to continue to rebuild it later.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm happy that you brought up the BRIC grants. We've helped several communities access that, over the past couple of years, and it's been such a great resource for, especially communities that we work with. So I'm happy to hear that there's some plans or things underway to continue with that program from ASCE's standpoint. Thanks for diving into that, Caroline.
Thank you.
I know we've been getting some great questions. Kelly, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, definitely. We have quite a few good questions here in the Q&A. Let me just get it opened up. So I'll start from the top. Caroline, I think this first question in here was for you when we were talking about the overall report card. So I can reference back to that slide here in just a second, but it says, is the gap dollar value to get to a grade of A or to a respectable B?
It's to get to a respectable B. So at ASCE, we are not, and we are never advocating for A grades. Actually, we think the greatest success would be to be at a very solid B. Essentially, as we are looking at the infrastructure categories, and this goes into our larger methodology, and I did not bore all of you with that today. I will define an A grade as essentially that bridge before the ribbon cutting. That's not sustainable for communities to keep the infrastructure in that condition. We are looking for B grades, which means essentially we are keeping infrastructure in a state of good repair. There's an asset management plan in place for that infrastructure so that we know we're going to be able to address the needs throughout the future. That is really what a B grade looks like. And at ASCE, that's where we think we should be getting our infrastructure systems to. It's not going to be in that, that pristine condition. As I said, that's not really sustainable for the long term. We need to make sure there's that asset management plan in place and that the infrastructure is in that state of good repair. And that is what we consider a B.
Awesome. Thank you, Caroline. It looks like our next question comes from Sylvia. So I believe this one came up during Natalie's first example slide with our water and wastewater systems in Maryland that CECorps has worked with. And Sylvia is asking, if the report that you were describing is available for the public, and that she's helping neighbors with a similar situation and would like to share some lessons learned.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. It's not available for the public because when we generate reports, we hand them over to the communities and then they assume ownership of them. However, I'm happy to connect with you on that and yeah, happy to connect and share some lessons learned. We have several communities where in similar situations where we've developed preliminary engineering reports, and we can certainly redact some of that information and share that out. So I'll be sure to share my email address at the end of this. And yeah, we can connect, Sylvia. Thank you.
Awesome. Our next question comes from volunteer Terry Applegate. So he's asking about the report card. Caroline, I think this might be a question for you, but it could be for you and Natalie. But it asks, does the report card have granularity at the state and community level? If everyone has a funding gap, where is the money going to come from?
So I will first address the report card, the granularity of the report card at the state or community level. We do have report cards at the state level. So our national report card comes out every 4 years. And then our volunteers in the states do often take it upon themselves to do their own state report card. So actually just today, if anyone here is from Nevada, our Nevada state report card was released in Carson City just earlier today. Our Utah state report card came out a couple of weeks ago. We have an Ohio state report card coming out, I think on June 25th, a little bit later this month. And then Colorado is going to be coming out in July. So we're constantly rolling those out. That is done in close collaboration with our volunteers in the states. Those are really, the engineers in those states are really the ones who take it upon themselves if they want to go forward with this effort. It is a colossal undertaking when they take this on. And then they work with our team to make sure that they are using the appropriate data sources, that they're addressing the full methodology, that they're using the correct grading rubric, etc., and that all of the chapters kind of go in line with a lot of ASCE messaging. So we do have state report cards for close to every single state at this point. We still have a few outliers. Those tend to be states where we just don't have quite as many members, so it's more difficult for them to be putting together a full team. And we have some other state report cards that are going to be coming out in the near future, where it'll be the first time. North Carolina is a great example of that. So as the report card has gained in popularity, so has our state report card program. And then in terms of the funding gap itself, we don't have funding gaps by state. I will say that first. We do have some needs numbers by states on state fact sheets. If, again, I keep saying it, I'm a broken record. If you go to infrastructurereportcard.org, you can actually go in and see a lot of data and breakdown by your state as well as your state report card. But in terms of the funding gap and where that funding is going to be coming from, one thing we are always very clear about, especially because we work a lot with federal legislators, this is not a bill for the federal government. This is not a bill for the state governments. This is something where we really need to be working in close collaboration at all levels of government and the private sector in order to start to reduce this gap. However, I will note, we're probably never going to get $3.7 trillion to address this gap. So that's where at ASCE, we think we need to be bringing in a lot of those innovative solutions in order to get projects done on time and on budget. So if we can implement things like streamlining the permitting process so that a project isn't in review for 7 years before we can break ground, that's going to help bring down the overall price tag of a lot of these projects as well. But we also have to make sure we have the engineering workforce in place in order to make sure projects don't sit on the shelf for too long. So it all kind of goes hand in hand. So we're going to need those policy solutions to help drive down overall costs. And then it's going to be incumbent on all levels of government and the private sector to work together in terms of funding a lot of these projects.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer, Caroline. Just going down the list here, it looks like we are getting a few more questions coming in, but I want to get to as many as we can. So this next one comes from Carl Dupolt. And it says resilient infrastructure is crucial because it ensures that the continued functioning of essential services like energy, water, transportation, and communication during and after disruptive events such as natural disasters or economic downturns. By anticipating and mitigating risks and by designing infrastructure that can adapt and recover quickly, resilient infrastructure minimizes the impact of disruptions on communities and the economy. Agreed? So I think, yeah,
Strongly agree.
yeah, I think we all agree on that here at, CECorps, at EWB, ASCE. Awesome. Next one down the line. Philip is asking if there is any design guidance available for resiliency centers, as opposed to community storm shelters or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, as I mentioned, Philip, we've been seeing more and more of these resiliency centers, and we haven't designed them necessarily. We've more worked with communities to help turn buildings into places that can act as resiliency centers, after a storm event. I don't know if there are any national design guides available. Caroline, I don't know if you know either, but it's definitely something that, we could talk a little bit more about.
Yeah, I'm not sure. And at ASC we are a standard setting
Mhm.
organization. I don't think we have anything related to that.
I could certainly share some like best practices and what we have seen work for communities.
Great. Cool. So just continuing down the line, we have a question for Caroline. It says, Caroline, you mentioned the financial benefit of avoiding future harms. Are there examples of monetizing these avoided costs similar to energy performance contracts?
Um, so I'm trying to make sure I understand the question appropriately. Monetizing the avoided costs. I guess I'm not clear exactly what we mean by that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure from the question here, but I think maybe it's referring to like what the value of money saved is when you have infrastructure that avoids harm
Yeah, so
or avoids destruction.
we do have a lot of data in our Bridging the Gap study that breaks down by sector what the overall cost savings would be or impacts would be by investing in our infrastructure system. So you can break that down across manufacturing, agriculture, healthcare, transportation, etc. And that also breaks down into number of job losses and some other information like that. In terms of actual policy solutions, I think that can get into some of these benefits. That's where I think where can we be implementing life cycle cost analysis? Where can we be implementing asset management plans, so that we kind of know what these overall costs are going forward? I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, it looks like David put a clarifying question down here at the bottom. So defending against future harm costs, recovery money, can you turn the avoided costs into funds to pay for improvements?
That would be interesting, if there was a way to do that. I think that would be very difficult in terms of legislation, how you can take those avoided costs and then turn them into actual funding, because that getting really granular. I don't see how the CBO would score, or Congressional Budget Office would score some what those savings would be and translate that into funding. In terms of and then in terms of a community, you would still need some of those upfront costs from those savings. So I think that could be difficult to translate into legislative action.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Great. I'm just scrolling back here so that I can track where we left off on some of those other questions. Okay. So I believe there's a question here in the chat just asking if Engineers Without Borders works with any professional chapters on domestic engineering projects, which we definitely do. But Natalie, do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, I believe I answered that, but
Oh, great.
yeah, we currently have 80 ongoing CECorps projects across the US, most of which are um, being run by EWB chapters. So we have EWB chapters, and then we also have AWWA and ASCE volunteers that take on CECorps projects as well. So yes, in short, definitely yes. Happy to connect to, just to connect on how we can collaborate even more.
Awesome. Thanks, Natalie. And I think we are just about at time here. I see that there are several unanswered questions in the chat still. So I'm just trying to pick out like one or two that we might be able to answer quickly. And hopefully the rest we might be able to put into a response later on. So
I'm
I think,
answering a few in the chat as well
oh,
that are
great. Thank you so
easy.
much, Caroline. All right. So I see one here about an email for the professional development hour certificates for attending this webinar. I'm not sure if that is something that we were offering for this one, but I can check in. I can check in with our team and see if that's something that we are able to do for this webinar. And if so, we will definitely send them out afterwards. But I'm not sure if that was something that we had built into the content for this. Okay, great. Well, that puts us right at 5 o'clock. I will make sure that the recording of this webinar gets out to everybody within the next day or so. And if we can, we'll also try to scoop up some of these last remaining unanswered questions from the chat and include those in the response email when the recording goes out. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And big shout out to Caroline for joining us from over at ASCE as well as Natalie, who it is also Natalie's birthday today for anybody who didn't know. So
Happy birthday.
thanks for spending your
Thank
birthday
you.
with us.
There's not a better way to celebrate.
Thanks. I know it was a great way. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right.